With us today on the summit is Dr. Paul Hroux. Paul, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
You're very welcome.
I'm just going to share your bio with our viewers at this time. Dr. Paul Hroux is a scientist with experience in electrical engineering of 15 years and in the health sciences, 30 years. After rounding out his formation with courses in biology and medicine, he became interested in health problems connected with electromagnetism. On the occasion of a project linking low-frequency magnetic fields to occupational cancers, he was appointed associate professor at McGill University's Faculty of Medicine in the Occupational Health Program, of which he is the current director. He teaches toxicology and the health effects of electromagnetism in this program. Paul, that's a very solid background. Is there anything you wish to add to that?
Well, to work in this area, you have to scan many disciplines. And I think this has been a very dominant problem in the area that many of the people involved know about engineering or they know about health, but very few people are equally comfortable on both sides of the fence.
Excellent. Well, thank you for helping us bridge that gap. My first question is, the telecommunications industry and the power utility industry claim that there's no way that a mechanism can be explained from harm from EMF. What could you tell us about this?
Well, the most charitable thing that I can say about that is that this is fake science. And the notion that there is no mechanism was popularized by industry essentially to escape regulation. In other words, if you claim there is no mechanism, there is no basis, there is no effect, everything vanishes. You can achieve this even in discussion with biologists by always raising the bar of the proof that is necessary to acknowledge a mechanism. So if you have a very resistant mind, you never find anything. And unfortunately, industry has been able to voice this opinion from so many different directions that it has had effect even on people who might, I would say, who should know better. For example, the epidemiologists at IARC see in human populations the effects of this radiation, both at low frequencies and high frequencies, but they parrot the opinion of industry that we don't know what the mechanism is. But to excuse them, they're also embedded in a culture of molecules and biochemistry that doesn't make it easy for them to see what the mechanisms are. But in truth, very quickly after these problems associated with electromagnetic radiation were discovered, even in the Western world, people very quickly converged on the problem. They solved it. They had accurate comments on what was happening, but this was absolutely ignored because you can raise the bar as high as you want. And so the mechanisms that explain the action of electromagnetic fields are very well known. They're better known than they are for most drugs that are on the market today. But if you have of the opinion that we will not accept a mechanism until the last aspect that we believe is important is clarified, you will never admit to anything. And this is what essentially industry has, how they have acted, essentially because of self-interest.
In terms of mechanism, is your perspective similar to that of Martin Pall and others who are talking about voltage-gated calcium channels and peroxynitrite and other elements involved in that model?
If you know anything about science, is that every scientist has a slightly different opinion and different angle on the given problem. So Martin Pall focuses on one thing, I focus on something different. I focus on the inhibition of metabolism in mitochondria and how this generates reactive oxygen species and how this can affect, various diseases. In the past, calcium has been involved through the work of Ross 80. And what Ross 80 found is that he had calcium efflux from cells in the nervous system when he stopped radiation. And the reason why that occurred is that when you apply the radiation, you minimize metabolism. And when you stop the radiation, the cell is now able to expel the calcium out of the cell, which it wasn't able to do before. So calcium was, in my opinion, accidentally involved and is not the central figure, but it is an immediate consequence of electromagnetic radiation. So if you want to discredit an area of science, you can always point to differences between scientists because they're all looking at the same rock from different angles. So if you want to maximize these differences, and you can quote comments by Paul and comments by Hroux and say they're inconsistencies, you can always go that way. But I think both Paul's work and mine are entirely valid.
Good, thank you for that. Just to jump back to the industry standards, they still are only recognize thermal effects. And could you talk just for a moment about that? What's your perspective on, the industry perspective that the only mechanism is heat, or that related to heat being caused by wireless radiation?
Well, heat is a criterion that was retained by industry to design protection for populations, simply because it is an extreme effect that occurs at very, very high intensities. And what this would do to retain this criterion would be to essentially give industry free hand to deploy almost any type of telecommunication systems that they want. And they achieved this by placing on committees people who would have these opinions. In other words, historically, industry has supported research on heat specifically, and the scientists who were, so to speak, supported to work on heat sort of naturally gravitate towards this variable as opposed to anything else. So they have created, so to speak, a small community of scientists who view heat as the end all and don't want to see anything else. So you can create a strong bias in science by having a bit of funding thrown at universities, by having a lot of participation on professional committees, and essentially controlling the evolution of a discussion by numbers of participants. And this is exactly what happened.
Very good, thank you. Tell us, if you could speak a little bit more on reactive oxygen species and help us to paint a picture of understanding of how EMFs and wireless cause reactive oxygen species.
So as you know, reactive oxygen species are a very important actor in biology, in the sense that we know that reactive oxygen species are essentially radicals of oxygen in great part that are able to attack and injure the cells internally. They are part of normal metabolism. As you live, you inevitably generate a reactive oxygen species as a normal course of the act of living. And as early as the 1950s, people like Denhan Harmon theorized that part of aging is due essentially to a reactive oxygen species. And since then, the notion, a little bit like the notion of stress in psychology, the notion of reactive oxygen species being biologically active in a number of diseases has taken hold. So any agent that generates reactive oxygen species will be considered to be more or less deleterious. Of course, in some cases, a small amount of reactive oxygen species can stimulate defense mechanisms, but overall, they are seen as agents that can aggravate uh, the tendency for various, I would say, diseases to become aggravated. So these reactive oxygen species are very, I would say, inevitably generated by electromagnetic radiation, because electromagnetic radiation changes metabolism in mitochondria, these little bugs inside the cells. If you inhibit the transfer of charges, you increase the polarization of mitochondria. There is only one value, 139 millivolts, that is optimal for mitochondria. You apply radiation, this goes up. If you apply the radiation for a long time, the cell will compensate by increasing metabolism. If you then withdraw the radiation, the polarization becomes too low. So however way you see it, if you depart from this optimal value, you will have more reactive oxygen species than is normal in a given tissue. And so if, for example, as an individual, you have vulnerabilities in your pancreas, in your brain, in your heart, in your digestive system, wherever that happens, increasing reactive oxygen species will accelerate the development of these diseases. So this is the way in which electromagnetic radiation, which is a very irregular form of exposure, against which the body has no means of defense, will essentially depart from the optimal value. And there's many examples in physiology of similar systems in mitochondria. For example, in mitochondria, it's known there is only one concentration of iron that is optimal. Higher and lower is very, very bad for you. And this is why in the human body, you have all sorts of molecules that manage the concentration of iron. But in terms of electromagnetic radiation that is entirely artificial, we haven't had the time in the last 100 years to compensate for this entirely new agent, because our body plan, mitochondria, have been around for 2 billion years. They can't adapt to, I would say, to the engineering community's plans within the short span of 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. Is peroxynitrite, or ONOO minus, is that an example of a reaction, a reactive oxygen species?
Yes, they are. You can imagine that there's a zoo of molecules that are created. We have enzymes like catalase that are and hydrogen peroxidase, which are all sorts of precautions that physiology has taken to eliminate these I would say, these noxious agents from the body.
Okay, very good. And in your work, you also talk about action metabolic disturbances, correct? Can you explain what that is and how that relates to EMF?
The most important molecule in the body is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Are you familiar with this?
Yes. I'm not a scientific expert on it. I need to put that out there as a disclaimer, but yes, I'm familiar with ATP.
So how much do you weigh?
185.
Okay. You consume 185 pounds of ATP per day.
Okay.
In other words, you generate it, you consume it, but this is your daily turnover. So it's a substance that is a little bit to the cell like money. So you know that no government wants to run out of money. You know what happens to the US government when Trump closes it down, right?
Yeah, it stops working.
Everything stops. So in the cell, it's the same thing. You can't run out of ATP. So even though there is electromagnetic radiation in the environment, the cell knows it cannot run out of ATP. So there is a large molecule called AMPK alpha which is tasked with shutting down and turning on processes so that the budget is respected. So whenever you have electromagnetic radiation in the environment, this enzyme manages for the cell to stay alive. So all of these processes are ongoing. You apply radiation, AMPK alpha has some work to do. And there's downstream consequences on practically every physiological system in the cell. The truth is that we're relatively insensitive to the presence of electromagnetic radiation unless we're hypersensitive. So few people can sense it. Most of us cannot, courtesy of AMPK alpha. But what AMPK alpha is not telling you is all the things that it's doing to compensate. And so essentially, when you have to compensate for something in your environment, this prevents you from doing other things that you would like to do at the cellular level. So essentially, this leads to a type of metabolic exhaustion that becomes more, I would say, more of a load the older you are and the more marginal your physiological systems are. So this is why electromagnetic radiation that varies a lot depending on whether you're phoning or not. Even if you are just walking around the streets, you are subjected to radiation that is in pulses, which means that they come on and off. Within the pulses of radiations, there are frames that have variations within them. And so all of this radiation that is entirely irregular in your environment sort of requires biology to make adjustments on a continuous basis. And it is this adjustment that in the end can increase cancer, can increase neurological diseases, can increase diabetes, and so on and so forth.
Very interesting. So whether somebody is, you could say, electrosensitive or not, feels the effects or not, their body from exposure to 5G, 4G, all kinds of wireless, has to compensate at the chemical level, that requires taking more energy. So the metabolic processes are negatively affected, even if you feel it or can't feel it. And those metabolic processes are associated with these, by the sounds of it, is what you're suggesting, are they associated with these increase that we're seeing in all of these, neurological and autoimmune and germless chronic diseases? Is that correct?
Yes, there's many diseases that have increased over the last century, ever since we have exposed ourselves to new types of radiation. I don't want to give the impression that all these diseases are completely caused by electromagnetic radiation, but since radiation is very, very intimately connected with reactive oxygen species, a predictable view is that they will enhance these diseases. Apparently, at the beginning of the century, there was practically no diabetes around. You could say that it wasn't diagnosed as well, but the increase has been very, very substantial. And when they introduced digital cellular phones, there has been an increase as well. So what this indicates is that in all probability, the environment that we invented through technology for electromagnetic radiation, an environment that has increased by billions and billions of times from what it was originally, has a real impact on diseases that, in a sense, we have been accustomed to. So we all die from cancer. We all have Parkinson's. We all have Alzheimer's. And when you're a victim of these diseases, you think it's somehow inevitable. Well, maybe it's not. And maybe if we took better care of our environment, the incidence of these diseases would abate. So in my opinion, it is well worth the while to purify progressively our electromagnetic environment. We will recuperate the costs very substantially in decreased health costs.
So you're saying the science is indicating very strongly that EMF is one of the main agents of the increase in these diseases. And do you see them, is this a long-term irreversible thing? Once you have exposure up to a certain point, is it irreversible? Or how do you see this in the long term, both at an individual exposure level and cumulatively throughout society?
Well, you're touching on a very, very delicate point here. If you're an engineer, one of the things that you assume about this question is that, well, if this radiation turns out to be deleterious, well, we'll just turn it off and everything will go back to normal. Biologists know better than that. And the reason why a biologist might be worried about this situation is that some things in biology, in other words, the evolution of a species, can be thrown in a certain direction in a way that is irreversible. So if you look at the evolution of humans from what was essentially unicellulars billions and billions of years ago, 2-3 billion years ago, essentially what happened is that we have relied since the earliest times on a proper supply of ATP. This has been a mantra of living systems. So if you look at various processes in evolution, even reproduction, sperms racing towards the egg is essentially an ATP race. In other words, it's a truly 100-yard dash to the egg. And what you're selecting for is effective ATP, effective energy, because life feels it can't do without it. Now, you come into the modern world and you decide we're going to interfere with this ATP generation mechanism. We're going to confuse it. And so what will happen over time when you apply this confusion to germinal cells in the body? Is it possible that the mitochondria could become altered at the population level? And since we've become competent in things like in vitro fertilization, and we've been knowledgeable about the evolution of populations of mitochondria within cells. In a human egg, there are, how would you say, Josh, how many mitochondria are there in a single human egg?
I have no idea.
Well, it's 1/3 of a million.
Wow.
So it's a population there. So you apply fields to these mitochondria, maybe you will switch the population to a given type of population. And as you do this over decades and decades, essentially, I would say, confusing the efficiency of ATP utilization. This means that the main driver of human evolution and of all animal and plant evolution has now been downgraded. In other words, the stock market doesn't recognize that this is a blue chip anymore. So you're altering, perhaps in an irreversible way, what will happen to humans and to all living systems. It doesn't mean that it's death for everything. It simply means that you're going to impose a detour on biology that it did not foresee. We have counted on ATP and on mitochondrial metabolism in all organisms on this planet until now. And people who know these problems tell us, perturb this mechanism at your peril.
Yeah. Wow. That is a heavy comprehension, a heavy understanding. Thank you for explaining that and the risks specifically relating to the mitochondria in the egg. We know that a female is born with all of the eggs that she will produce in her lifetime, right?
Yes.
So that's very significant. Shifting gears a bit, I have a layperson interest in quantum physics, so this is interesting to me. You have discussed in your work that wireless signals have a fractal structure, fractal nature. Can you tell us more?
Well, what I mean by this is that um, in data transmission using electromagnetic waves, you have a carrier, right? The carrier can be 950 megahertz. It can be 1.9 gigahertz. It can be 2.45 gigahertz. These signals vary continuously at that frequency. And then in order to add data to this, essentially, this signal, you create a modulation, which in the industry is labeled as time domain multiple access, which means that you chop the signal on the carrier into small quantities. And you also have FDMA, which means frequency domain multiple access. So you change the frequencies, you change the amplitude very, very rapidly. And within the frames and the bursts that you send, you have encoded data, which means that there have to be discontinuities in the signal that essentially carry the data. And of course, when you walk around, in a city, you are subjected, depending on your proximity to an antenna, to various levels of radiation. And then when you put a cell phone to your head, again, you are subjected to different levels of radiation. So on many, 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 many time scales, this signal is very, very variable. So remember the compensation that biological systems have to perform. If you add too many of these irregularities in the signal, in the end, you increase the load of adaptation that biological systems have to perform. Now, there are electrical systems in the body, but these are very, very old electrical systems. And this is part of natural radiation. For example, the magnetic fields of your heart are 100 times smaller than the magnetic fields from power lines. But the heart, over time, has had a long, long, long duration in which to adapt and handle these signals. And all of a sudden, within the last 100 years, you add 100-fold level to this signal. It's not unexpected that you would not be able to adapt immediately. So on many, many different time scales, unfortunately, electromagnetic radiation requires the body, the cells, the mitochondria to adapt to varying circumstances.
Yeah. I appreciate that explanation about the adaptation that is required of us, even though we're not conscious of that. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Um, especially since we can't see wireless signals. Our brain, like, we don't process this stuff consciously, so that helps. I just have a question about, you mentioned the signals are chopped. Is that anything to do with the square wave? And secondly, is it the chopping of the signals, like data is being put through at several milliseconds and seconds and then ends? Is that firm, on off mechanism? Does that what creates the actual fractal that you mentioned?
Yes, it is. In a sense that, for example, in the particular application of cell phones, you have to broadcast electromagnetic radiation. You're going to do this by compressing the sound of the voice that you're trying to broadcast into a fraction of its original duration, compress that digitally, and you're going to activate an oscillator that generates the carrier and encodes the data for a short amount of time. So typically, you might have bursts or signals that occupy only less than 10% of the duration of your voice signal. And this is essentially to allow many users to use the same frequencies. Of course, in a single call, the system might shift you to another frequency, which would mean a further adaptation. But all of these good engineering ideas that would be perfectly good inside an optical fiber are a bit troublesome for humans who are exposed to them, because digital transmission means that you have to have a type of sudden change, as you indicate, a square wave. This has a large signal to noise ratio, so it's easily regenerated over repeaters and over long distances. But this digital transmission essentially means a shock. And if you have shocks at all sorts of time frames, it's very difficult for biological systems to handle this if it is radiation that they have never encountered in the last 2 billion years.
Really interesting. This might be a bit of a stretch, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. Do you think that these mechanisms, what you're talking about now, have an effect on, for example, how we as biological beings experience time?
I think that it is inevitable, but the brain doesn't have a great feedback on itself. For example, levels of serotonin in the brain, you can change that by eating a banana, but you don't feel it because your consciousness is sort of a free-flowing balloon going through the atmosphere, and you're not necessarily informed of things that are not incredibly critical. So if you slow down, you think that others are ramping up. And if you ramp up, you think that everybody else is incredibly slow. So, for example, we believe that radiation from cell phones diminishes the sensitivity of your hearing. And it doesn't do this in a massive way, but it does this in a detectable way. And as well, it probably affects your thinking. It's very well documented that exposure to cell phone radiation has a tendency to impair memory. Yet we use this radiation, we want to use this radiation for schools, in young children. And so this is an aspect that is widely unrecognized, but there are immediate mental impacts of this radiation that are not easy to detect. But then lead impacts, lead as a neurotoxicant. These effects are essentially people who are the victims are completely unconscious. They're just dumber. So you were able to introduce tetraethyl lead in gasoline in the 1920s, and 15 million American children lost 10 IQ points as a result. They don't know this, and General Motors will never be sued for that because all you have is a dumber American population. So essentially, you're going to have impacts on the mind inevitably, but it doesn't mean that you're going to feel them.
Wow. So you're talking about impacts specifically on 5G. What do you see as the impacts if 5G is widely deployed?
Well, 5G, as you know, is just an extension of the cellular system. So the first impact of 5G, which is really the plan of industry, is to increase cellular phone use because they want you to buy a new cell phone every year because they have become dependent on this success. In other words, cell phones are very, very appreciated by individuals. And so they want to increase the data rate so that people will use them more and more and more. So what this means, unfortunately, is that if you use your cell phone a lot more, you are going essentially to expose yourself a lot more. And if people want more, you're going to need more antennas everywhere to provide more signal. So this is the first problem. There is a second problem. You want to increase the data rate. That means that you have to increase the frequency because the bit rate is proportional to frequency. So to provide more data, you have to increase the frequency. So by increasing the frequency, you concentrate the radiation on the surface of the body. And so industry is saying, oh, isn't this great? We're not going as deep within the human body. Of course, that all depends on your point of view. If you talk to Ole Johansson of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, who's a specialist about the effects on skin of this radiation, he believes that melanoma is essentially caused by electromagnetic radiation and not necessarily by ultraviolet radiation. And in this regard, you have to notice that 5G radiation, even at its highest frequencies, would have a penetration depth much larger than ultraviolet radiation, which is already known to create cancer. So it's by no means true at all that you are immune to health effects if you simply increase the frequency. That is not true. The other thing is that if there is a large increase in data transfer requirements, you have to put antennas everywhere, which means that these people that we call the hypersensitive, I don't know if you know any, but I know that many of them are looking for places where the radiation in the fields are not too high. Proliferation of antennas everywhere means that the antennas will always be closer to them. That means they will have nowhere to run. And this terrifies them because they feel, although there may be a small segment of the population, they are the ones who feel the radiation. Some of them feel it as it happens. And so these people need to get away from the radiation. Some of them shield their homes and can barely come out of their homes. So there's a big problem for them. And the other thing is that 5G is a bit different from the previous antennas that we had. In the past, they would find some land or from some rooftop and they would install antennas. Now they're going to install them in communities almost everywhere, which means that this will define what we will recognize as a normal environment for decades to come. In other words, this wireless link that, in my opinion, should have been an optical fiber link instead will become part of our lives in the same way that power lines have become part of our lives. And of course, there's the last ingredient in that in the recent decades, you realize that the proliferation of electromagnetic radiation signals everywhere means loss of privacy, in the sense that do we want a society in which everything we do and think almost is available to someone else? So with 5G, because there is beamforming, they will not only know in which region of the city you are, they will know in which room you are. And with other types of information that can be retrieved from devices that they would like to sell you in the future that emit radiation and information, they'll know everything that you're doing. So do we want this type of society? To what extent do we limit the individual to have privacy? Shouldn't all of these Internet of Things devices be turned off when they're sold to you, and you have to agree, maybe on an annual basis, and there has to be a visible reminder that they're sending information to others. Otherwise, you're owned by somebody else. And so you already see this in software industry trying to, I would say, train people into accepting submission. You have these softwares that ask you, do you give us authorization to retrieve data from your premises with this piece of equipment? And you have two choices, yes, or I'll think about it later. This says everything about the intentions of industry. You might be worried about spying from foreign governments. What about spying from your government? What about spying from all corporations? You are an individual. Do you have any rights left? Is also a concern.
Wow, thank you so much for that piece and just helping to contextualize. That's very helpful. You mentioned about beamforming in 5G. Can you tell us, Paul, about the origin and purposes of beamforming and its applications around 5G and what that entails?
There is a widely viewed video of Tom Wheeler, formerly a director of the FCC, saying that he was going to deploy 5G without waiting for standards. And this was the result of innovative new stuff by American engineers. Actually, beamforming used in 5G is a very, very old thing. In other words, if you have a large array of antennas as opposed to a single one, you can actually steer the radiation. You know that in radar, you rotate antennas continuously to see where the planes or the ships are coming from. The advantage of these array of antennas is that you don't have to rotate anything. You can, by very subtle adjustments of the antenna itself, send the beam in one direction or the other. For example, the Russians were the first in 1981 to deploy in the MiG-31 the Zaslon radar, a very, very powerful radar, which allowed an aircraft, a fighter aircraft, to send a signal in one direction and then be totally quiet. And then another signal and then be totally quiet. In other words, you can keep track of an enemy without broadcasting your position all the time. So in the implementation that would be in 5G, you would have beams that are 5 to 10 degrees in width, being shot a little bit like similar to laser beams in one direction, in the direction of a customer who has a need for communication. So this, in a sense, is very, very nice to pack more information into a given volume, in the sense that before we used different frequencies, and then we used different time slots. So the frequencies in frequency domain and the time slots in time domain. Now we can slice the volume because we can use beams that are very, very narrow. This means that we can transmit even more data. Isn't it wonderful? But also, it also gives you information of exactly where the customer is. So all of these beamforming means that you will be able to pack more devices within a given space. And of course, having a beam of that sort, which is higher frequencies, and higher frequencies don't penetrate as well, you would need to increase the level of the radiation, because higher frequencies of radiation don't broadcast very, very well. They tend to be stopped by leaves and by rain and things like that. So they're not 100% reliable. So you want to have more signal level. Also, this radiation is absorbed by water and oxygen in the air. The air is not quite so transparent. And then there's the antenna aperture that is smaller at these frequencies. So all of these factors combine to necessitate higher levels of this radiation. And it's going to be more laser-like. In other words, you're not using the radiation. You might not be exposed unless you're in the path of the radiation. But when you are using it, you will be exposed very strongly to radiation at that time. So there's going to be more of a variation over time in your exposure. So this is higher technology that is directly derived from the military, that is not anything new, but is a logical expansion of the performance of wireless systems. So it all speaks to the notion, how much wireless do we need in our lives? And my contention is that the important contributions of wireless in terms of having communications mobile have already been done. I don't think that you really need to download three-dimensional movies in buses. And all of the promotion around 5G, which is really inspired by the need for you to upgrade your equipment, are presenting applications that may or may not work, that are fantasies, and that can only occur, many of them, only if you increase the data rate tremendously. And this data rate increase would only be possible with optical fiber. In the case of cars, industry, the telcos are trying to convince both the car manufacturers and everybody else that self-driving cars are impossible without 5G. This is not true. You have self-driving cars that rely entirely on laser scanning and on computer vision that will outclass 5G because they don't need telecommunications. They can see what's happening around them. So the future will not crash if we don't have 5G. But this is natural for industry to give you the impression that if you don't have the next upgrade to your equipment, you will die in the dark, frozen, and that will be that.
So you've mentioned self-driving cars not needing 5G, but that being one of the talking points of proponents of 5G. You mentioned the surveillance and privacy aspects of 5G. Both of these relate to the Internet of Things. Is there anything else you want to say about the Internet of Things and any problems that you see associated with that?
Well, the Internet of Things is the engineering idea that every object, we've saturated more or less, I would say, subscriptions to the Internet from individuals. So if you want to expand your commerce base, the next thing is that you're going to put emitters in everything that you sell, and data will be exchanged ongoingly with all of these things. In other words, everything in the world will be exchanging data, and what will happen to the people in the middle of this radiation is a little bit unknown. But this vision of having emitters everywhere runs a bit into a problem, because there's what we call the Shannon equation in engineering. And what this says is that the amount of data that you can send is dependent on the signal to noise ratio in the environment. And if you increase the number of radiating structures and radiating items, the noise is going to get higher. And if the noise gets higher, you're going to have to install increasingly selective filters and digital, I would say, noise exclusion to improve the transmission of the signal. So obviously, this is I would call a self-limiting possibility IoT, because the first thing is that maybe we don't want everything to transmit. And in particular, I don't want to go to a store and buy an object that will irradiate me without my knowledge. I think this is very, very important. But the main point is that this dream of having everything radiating is a dream that is essentially one of engineers who have been told that this radiation has no impact whatsoever. In a sense, our perception of reality can be distorted sometimes. Another way in which it is distorted is by NASA. NASA is giving a picture, and Hollywood is giving a picture because it's very amusing, of us humans exploring outer space and meeting civilizations from other galaxies and so on. The truth is that this will not happen soon. Not only because there's not that many civilizations out there, but the main reason is that they're incredibly far. And far means in comparison with human lifespans. And so the thing that NASA does not talk very, very much about is what happens to humans when they go in space. And it's not good things that happen to humans when they are in space. So engineering has a tendency to see rosy pictures ahead of themselves. And fine, it drives their industry, but they have also a tendency to be rather blind to how the human will fare within this technological development. And in the case of IoT, it's more or less the same thing. They want to convince us that there's a need, when in fact, the need may be legitimate within, say, a plant where you want every device to communicate together. And they are also very, very quickly passing over the subject of interference and reliability. Whereas if you use optical fiber, do you know what is the ratio of capability of transmission between 5G and optical fiber?
Well, optical fiber is probably, I don't know, if I had to guess, it's 10 times more data throughput and many times more secure. I don't know, though.
Well, as you know, optical fiber is totally secure because the signal is confined within the fiber. Now, you have 4G. 4G is about maybe 1 gigabyte per second. With 5G, maybe we'll get 10 gigabytes per second. Or some people say maybe even 20 gigabytes per second. Now, Optical fiber, Bell Labs has demonstrated 100 million gigabytes per second internet speed over 2 kilometers. So there is no competition. That doesn't mean that we have the electronics right now commercially available to reach these speeds, but there's absolutely no comparison at all between optical fiber and wireless. Ultimately, you install an optical fiber, it can go at tremendous speeds if you only upgrade the electronics. And if you circle the Earth 3.5 times with an optical fiber that is mechanically stable because it's buried in the ground and trees don't fall on it, it will have one failure every 35 years. So you're talking about a completely different horse. In other words, any sophisticated society in the future needs and will depend on optical fiber, which is what the telcos use for themselves because they know their stuff. But it seems at the moment to be more commercially, I would say, desirable for you to depend on wireless because you're going to buy cell phones and you're going to buy subscriptions. Whereas if you put a fiber in one building, the guy can buy a router and internet the whole space. So we want telcos to make money. Sometimes we have to tell them how they should do it.
Yes, thank you. I had a great conversation as part of this summit with Dr. Timothy Sheckley, who advocated a very clear plan for using existing copper and new fiber, and would highly recommend, that interview as well. Just to clarify, my guess was 10 times faster. I'm learning about this as we go, and I'm having the experts on. And what you're saying is optical fiber is 5 to 10 million times faster than 5G.
Well, it has been demonstrated to have this potential.
Okay, good.
It's what maybe it has. And of course, if they bring a fiber to your home, your speed will be limited by the fiber by the backbone fiber that the telco uses. But what I'm saying is that an investment in optical fiber can be upgraded to incredible speeds in the future. Whereas wireless, you'll always have to change the whole system.
Yeah, and so Timothy Sheckley and others were really advocating teaming up with educating our local governments, letting them know, not only is it their job to protect their constituents and to keep, make sure their health is not harmed, but to see the bigger picture, to see solutions, to see the efficacy of wired solutions such as optical fiber to the building, to the company, to the home. So thank you for mentioning that. You mentioned NASA as an example. That got me thinking to ask you about the satellite aspect, the satellite system for sending 5G signals. We've heard that 20,000 or more satellites are set to be deployed. What's your take on that?
Well, I have not explored all the aspects of this deployment, but of course, there are aspects that are very, very simple. If you're going to send that many satellites into orbit, you will have to have that many rockets maybe taking them, and maybe this creates pollution. But from the point of view of the electromagnetic environment, I think this is a rather interesting solution. The reason being that if you want fast worldwide communications, what you can do is that you could have on the roof of houses large antennas that have a lot of gain that can use very small levels of signals, and you could have satellites that broadcast telecommunication signals from outer space at very, very low levels that you could use in your home. So in a sense, those would be fixed systems. And of course, these antennas could be solar cells as well. So a solar cell could double as an internet antenna at very, very low levels. So, we are protesting 5G because it brings these cell phone antennas so much closer to us. If there is a technique of telecommunications that removes these antennas from us, in my opinion, we should be happy in as much as it reduces the exposure of people. But this is the type of solution that could essentially provide worldwide coverage at very low exposures, maybe that will be entirely tolerated by humans, and would be very, very effective because of the opportunity of using solar cells coupled with a receiving antenna and a transmitting antenna. And there's no one in the path.
At low power, right? So you're saying that there's a way, potentially, according to your modeled understanding there, that we can use a satellite-based system to communicate, like a satellite dish on homes, for example, to communicate with the satellite-based system at a low level, which should, scientifically be at levels low enough so that there's no harm, rather than having small cells every 2 to 10 homes just blasting in all directions. So you're saying that could be done safe?
Yes, well, from the point of view of electromagnetic exposures, if we're going to use that type of wireless instead of optical fiber, which is still very much faster, that would be the least damaging solution that you can think of. And, in my house, I have an atomic clock, which is essentially synchronized by an antenna in Colorado. And these clocks synchronize using extremely, extremely small signal levels. They're not very, very fast, but they use very small signal levels. And the cell phone system that we have today uses levels of signals that are enormously higher than that. What we aim to do if we're going to use wireless is to use the smallest levels of radiation possible. We don't necessarily mean to exclude wireless entirely, and we know we won't.
Good. Yeah, thank you for that, visioning that potential solution. And in terms of minimizing the risk, I'm very much on board with that. It's more difficult to stop, and all aspects of a locomotive train, but if we can reroute the train, right, with intention, with knowledge, with care for humanity, then that's much more doable, is it not?
Yes, I think so. I think you're right. Nobody wants to stop progress. We all want to have more access to data. Wherever that leads us, we see that it's leading to some political and economic difficulties, but hopefully humans are wise enough to manage those. What we don't want is to shoot ourselves immediately in the foot in developing telecommunication methods that are immediately deleterious to health. We want people and technology to grow together, not at the expense of each other.
Yes, thank you. So just as we wrap up here, I want to close with a question that is, related, and it's also about our children. We're realizing that the effect of tech addiction and screen addiction and kids using phones is far worse than we anticipated in this problem. It's far more prevalent. It's having effects biologically. It's having effects just socially. What can you say, in terms of kids and smartphone or tech addiction, and bring some wisdom and insight and perhaps some science into this part of the discussion?
Well, Shandong province in China is controlling the access of school children to cell phones because of the increase in myopia. You're going to get curvature of the spine. There's a number of aspects to cell phones that are very troubling, and I hope we can handle them. One of them is the obsession with not missing any communication and the increase in such signals. The segmentation of attention. These media tend to want to draw your attention for commercial purposes, which means that a book is going to be a challenge in the future because it's a lot less exciting than the dancing pictures that you see in heightened intensity on a cell phone. So it speaks to excitation of our visual system. It speaks to the segmentation of our capacity to be attentive. And in many communities that I have seen, people say people used to talk to one another. Now they all walk with their nose on their cell phone. And of course, they're talking to somebody or something. But if you've seen, for example, the communication that is a quality, that is a consequence of emails or of commercials, it's not the same thing as human communication. So we should not let one type become totally dominant over the other. So cell phones have great use. They can be redesigned to minimize human exposures, and we have to do that. Don't worry, we're not going to take your cell phone away. We would just like to harness it and to provide you with a channel of incredible rates of communication to a workstation that will make you leave your cell phone to the side.
And you could, for example, have a system set up within the home and within buildings where you just have like a docking station for your phone, right? And quickly and easily wire it so that you only use the wireless capabilities on the phone when you're not in a room with a docking station, for example, right?
That's right. And it's probable that using light, frequencies of light that living systems grew up with, like infrared or visible light, as in Li-Fi, for example, I'm sure you've heard about that, instead of microwaves, is probably a good idea. It would minimize biological impacts. And if you have a docking station, you could, without making a connection, both charge your phone through light and transfer data at incredible rates into your phone as well. So we can have safe engineering if only we ask for it.
Very good. Well, that's an excellent point to end on. Dr. Paul Hroux, thank you so much for your time today and for being with us on the summit.
All right. Thank you, Josh.